for the first time in over 2,000, say 200 years, she was alive again. She was looking back at a different world, a different generation.
Christian Cardell Corbett is an artist, and he's referring to a woman who was mummified in ancient Egypt. For the past few months, he's been working on recreating her face, based on the shape of her skull. A skull that was created without unraveling a single thread of her wrappings. That's because scientists looked inside those wrappings using modern technology.
X-rays are extremely valuable in terms of giving you fairly quick and fairly low-tech, fairly simple images of what's inside the wrappings. One of the keys to all of this is it's non-destructive. What X-rays do not give you is three-dimensionality.
The mummy was X-rayed a few years ago, but the X-rays left questions, like whether it was male or female, and if she was a female, whether she was a princess. That's what the Salmon family thought they were buying on a trip to Egypt in the 1920s. The Salmons lived in Chatham, Ontario, and eventually donated the mummy to the Chatham-Kent Museum. Last spring, anthropologist Andrew Nelson arranged a CT scan for the mummy at St Joseph's Hospital in London, Ontario. He'd also had the outside wrappings laser scanned, as well as the cartonnage, an outer casing marked with hieroglyphics containing clues about who this mummy was. With the help of the National Research Council's Integrated Manufacturing Technologies Institute, he combined the laser scans and CT scans to come up with a 3D virtual image of the mummy. It's a tool that allows researchers to peek inside the wrappings whenever they like.
One of the things we've been able to do here is take the three-dimensional representation of the pelvis, which is a crucial part of the body to identify the sex of an individual, and we're able to rotate it into exactly the position that we need to be able to see, is this a male, is this a female? And it clearly turns out that this is a female.
From the skeleton, researchers began piecing together an osteobiography, the mummy's story as told by her bones. So far, they know she was in her mid-30s and a little taller than 5 feet. Her teeth were in bad condition. She had lots of cavities, and she had a little arthritis. But for Andrew Nelson, it's only the first step in getting to know the mummy better.
What's the first thing you recognize about somebody when you meet them? It's the face. And the lasting impression you have of somebody is their face. And so that really, it puts a whole different perception, a whole different way of looking at that person. Now it's no longer an artifact, now it's a person.
So how do you put a face to a person who died over 2,000 years ago and whose bones are under wraps? You save the skull on a CD and take it to a printer, of course. The drafting clinic in Mississauga prints all kinds of things, mostly for manufacturing companies trying to get new product designs just right before going into full production. For Sean Kelly, building the skull of a 2,000-year-old woman is pretty much the same as building a car part.
We're currently on our print layer number 54 out of 1,089. The indication as to exactly where we are in the build is the yellow and blue line that goes across the screen. And this represents the actual image that we are printing currently.
As you can see, the lower jaw is a separate piece from the rest of the skull. The pieces are being built simultaneously from the bottom up, in layers of powder 4/1000ths of an inch thick. As each layer is completed, the printer platform moves down, and the next layer is laid on top.
We've chosen to use a 4/1000ths of an inch layer slice here. So if we had asked for a thicker layer slice, we would end up with somewhat of a stepping feature from one layer to another. This way, we're going to achieve a nice smooth. The part itself is about 2.5 to 3 pounds overall weight, probably fairly close to what the skull actually would be.
To reveal the skull's fine details, a final dusting off takes place, aided by a wand that fires compressed air.
All right, so what do we got?
Hey Andrew, do you recognize this?
Oh, absolutely. Man, Sean, that's just incredible. As we looked at the X-ray with the mandible and the skull separate, we really had the impression that she had really buck teeth. And when we were actually able to put the mandible and the skull together and to close her mouth, then the whole thing took on a whole proportionality that made it much more a harmonious looking skull, a harmonious looking face.
But a skull is not a face, and that's where Christian Cardell Corbett comes in. His hands manipulated this clay into the face of the ancient woman through a combination of art and science.
The key of the reconstruction is that the skull forms the essential shape of the face, the structure of the bones. So on the surface of the skull we put in tissue thickness markers that are based on just standard forensic tables of expected tissue thicknesses for certain populations. And then Christian worked through building muscle by muscle, and while the skull defines the essential shape of the face, the orientation and direction of the muscles provides the contours of the face.
But features like the mouth, the nose and ears aren't based on the bony architecture of the skull.
We relied to a great extent on artistic canons. An ear should run roughly from the corner of the lips up to about this level here. And there's these sort of rules of proportion.
To finish her off, Christian had to do a little research. He looked at textbooks for ideas on hairstyles. They actually wore wigs. And to Andrew's CT scans, which showed the Solomon mummy wearing what appeared to be a hair clip.
One of the most interesting things for me in seeing the final version of the face was to see that this was clearly somebody who was not from the classical Mediterranean area of Egypt, but this was somebody who had come from the south, from what was then called Nubia, what we now call Sudan, northern part of Sudan. And this really underscores the cosmopolitan character of the Egyptian empire, that it had lots of relationships with people to the south, it had relationships with cultures throughout the Mediterranean.
So the face tells us a lot more about who she was. But was the Solomon mummy a princess?
She probably was not the princess that she was sold, represented to the Solomon family, and we can tell that by comparing her to royal mummies that have been analyzed in other contexts. So she's probably somewhere in the middle class, upper middle class, something like that.
Today's technology has made it possible to recreate the mummy virtually and physically, which means experts and the public alike can learn more about ancient Egyptians without destroying what remains of them. Someone who will continue to learn all he can from the Solomon mummy is Andrew Nelson.
Mummies are people. We can learn about the past through buildings, we can learn about the past through pots, but if we examine the people themselves, we learn about the past in a completely different way. We can get a very empathic understanding of the past through understanding this person. And that I think is the ultimate reason that people are so fascinated by mummies, and I'm one of them.